Hello, I'm Michael Edwards. I'm speaking to you from our cottage in Burgundy, France. After Cambridge, I published several collections of poetry in English, and while lecturing in English universities, I published several books on literature and painting and other things before, strangely, and it still seems strange to me, turning to writing in French. While in the French phase, which is not completely gone, I published several more collections of poetry in Paris and many books on literature, painting, music, philosophy, theology, all attempting to include all the things that interested me into a single pattern. While I was still in England, I had accumulated quite a lot of poems towards a book which I already wanted to call Another Art of Poetry. We were living in a little village in Essex, a fishing village, and I found that the title was both modest. There have been many arts of poetry, this is just another one, and modest also in the sense that one cannot finally define poetry. I have a very strong sense of what I think poetry is, and I can defend it, but I know that to other people it will seem simply like my view. On the other hand, it's not so modest as it might seem, in that I do think this is an other art of poetry. It's an art of poetry which is other. It's based on my sense of the shape of history, the shape of life, itself based on the biblical sense of an Edenic world, a fallen world, and a new world to be created, new heavens and a new earth, as promised in the Bible. And it seemed to me that poetry, and indeed all the arts, including photography, dance, and so on, all the arts respond to this pattern, whether from Christians or not, given that we all have a kind of sense that, not that we lived in an Edenic world, but that there must sometime have been an Edenic world, and perhaps we had visions of it in our childhood. We all know that the world is not as it should be. If this were heaven, something would be amiss, even if we don't call it a fallen world. And we all, it seems to be, have a sense of a kind of perfect world in some future, and perhaps elsewhere. All utopias dream of this, including the Marxist utopia. And it is therefore not entirely modest. It's also different. It's another art of poetry, in the sense that while most of the poems that I wrote in the 1980s are written in short verses, short lines, and somewhat epigrammatic, many of them, and practically all of those that I wrote later, of which I'll speak, are about other subjects. They are poems concerning music, painting, heaven, earth, God, love, death, the big subjects, what's going on around me, how I relate to happenings, and so on. And they're all poems which, at the same time, I hope, throw light on the art of poetry. I wanted an art of poetry, in other words, which showed in itself, in its own making, and when you read it, that poetry is involved deeply, intimately with living. I then came back to this volume quite recently, and added numerous other poems. It's mainly the numerous other poems which move in all sorts of directions. And I was interested in these in developing the four-stress line of Anglo-Saxon poetry. It's always haunted me as the line possibly central not only to English poetry, but to the way in which we speak. Central to poetry in the way that even the pentameter, which includes, in principle, 5 stresses, nearly always has 4. To be or not to be, that is the question, and so on. And I developed this way of writing, which seemed to me correct. I wanted it to be as complex as possible, as complex as living is, and as complex as poetry is. And I was much aware in returning to English poetry of the relish of writing English, of being able to use those resources which are specific to English and which are not available in French. French, of course, has other resources available. In particular, for instance, there are many ways, in particular the prepositions and adverbs, which do so much more work in English than in most other languages. Down we went, for instance, in which all the movement and the excitement is not in the verb, we went, but in the down. I was also much taken by English continuous tenses. The way in which we can say not only I speak, but I am speaking. You will be travelling. The lawn was being mown. And it seemed to me that I had rediscovered English in a way, as I had already done in at the Brasserie Lippe. At the same time, it should be said that between at the Brasserie Lippe and this, Another Art of Poetry, I had also written a book called Doorstones. And the two books now come together perfectly appropriately, because I believe that Another Art of Poetry throws light on Doorstones, and it is clear that Doorstones, in a sense, puts into practice the sense of poetry in Another Art of Poetry, as I suppose all my books do, inevitably. And I chose the title, Doorstones, after assuming for a long while that it would actually be thresholds, and perhaps even trembling thresholds. But thresholds, while being a perfectly good Anglo-Saxon origin word, struck me as less striking than the word that came to me, which was Doorstones, quite evidently Anglo-Saxon, and interesting in the sense that it says in the title what the book of poetry is going to do. It's a word which seems familiar. Its parts are familiar. It talks about the daily world, door, stones. But since it's a word that hardly exists, perhaps actually doesn't exist, except that it exists now, since it's a word that doesn't exist, it turns the familiar into the strange. And it seems to me that that is one of the things that poetry does. It takes the world that we think we know and shows how strange, marvellous, sometimes terrible it actually is, but essentially how strange, how different it is from what we had expected, as if there were another world working through it, which is, of course, what I believe. And Doorstones is another series of poems writing about whatever occurred to me as the poems came, because I very much believe that poems, as it were, wish to be written. It's a series of poems, therefore, about how I relate to the world around me, how the world around me seems. It too picks up music and dancing, and not dancing, painting, God, the world, and everything. And it's a book which as I say, throws light, I think, on another art of poetry, but which after At the Brasserie Lip, in which I was also very often writing four-stress lines, writes mainly in pentameters. It seemed to me that after rediscovering, reworking, and exploring and trying to change the four-stress line, not writing like other poets who have written in four-stress lines, that I would come back to the central line of English poetry, the iambic pentameter, again, very much aware that you can't simply rewrite it, that it needs to be rewritten in the fuller sense. You need to develop the resources of the iambic pentameter. I'm tempted to say in the way in which Shakespeare did, but I'm not making that comparison. You see what I mean? You don't take the iambic pentameter and simply write it. And this book has a narrative underlining it. It's not a narrative book, but there is a narrative which occurs in the very first poem and which surfaces from time to time. And it's a narrative which is there to link all the other poems, which have got nothing to do with it in terms of the theme, and which I think the other poems enlighten. The narrative is very simple. It's, first of all, the narrative of David and Saul, or I should say Saul and David, chronologically, in the Old Testament. And it's an interesting story, which, of course, I don't just rewrite. There's no point in that. I explore it. I try to bring out things that haven't been seen. I try to look at it in another light. And one of the things which is clearly very interesting to a poet is that Saul has fits of melancholy and a kind of madness, and that he can only be assuaged by David playing on his harp. It's a beautiful story, obviously full of lots of different sorts of meaning, artistic, literary, as well as spiritual. And this is a strife story because they are, from the beginning, at loggerheads. In fact, they war against each other. Towards the end of the book, it's replaced by a similar story, which, in a sense, for me, continues it, although I don't think anyone has said this, and maybe it's wrong. That is the story of St. Paul in the New Testament, whose name was Saul. He was called Paul after his conversion. And Paul is very much aware as a Christian that he does what he wishes not to do, and he does not do what he wishes to do. A famous passage in Letters to the Romans. And he realizes, I think, at this moment, that Saul is still there. In fact, he talks about the new man and the old man. The new man is the Christian. The old man is what you were before. And this struggle within Saul Paul illuminates the Saul David story. I think illuminates many, many things, not only Christian living, but unchristian living. There is always this tension, this elusive I, which is at least double, if not multiple. And it's a book which, as I say, meshes with the other. It's placed after another art of poetry. In a sense, it could have been placed in the middle, and one would have had to work one's way through it. But I think this arrangement is better. I hope that's clear and interesting. I'd like to end with reading one of the poems, actually from Doorstones. The poems in Doorstones don't have a title. They don't have a title because, like all my books of poetry since I returned to English, and I've written others, not yet published, is a single poem written in the form of many poems. The poems work against each other. There are poems which pick up later, earlier poems, and so on. So they don't have titles, they're simply separated by asterisks. Beethoven's late, outlandish, unheard sounds, a Steinway in a spacecraft floating free. Sonorities that stretch the keyboard well beyond the growling and its icy wastes. When Saul fell back into the fallen self, mugged by a devil in the guise of gloom, the cunning harp of David broke the spell, and Saul, by listening, was refreshed and well. Beethoven listens to the silent keys, speaking a language that he hardly knows. A world in waiting beckons and withdraws. Uncanny mathematics found the way. The music, angel body that evolves in lucid raptness, would give ears to stones, gives tears to me, a glimpse of heaven here, of what's to come that wanting cannot bring. Those strains, immaculately real, that weird beauty, this joy, this gladness undeserved, alas, convict of sinfulness, of what, in scalding tears this Easter day, I am. The room reverberates with hammered sound, another world where one is lost and found.